and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, the Brit Pack is back. Welcome to episode number 8. It is Monday, September 12th, 2016. Simon Head and Shamakar Sandhu back again to look at the big stories in the world of mixed martial arts. And on this week's show, we take a look back at UFC 203 in Cleveland, Ohio, as Stipe Miocic retained his UFC heavyweight title after a crazy one-round battle with Alistair Overeem. We also take a look back at the long-awaited debut of former WWE superstar CM Punk, who found out just how tough life can be inside that UFC octagon. Even after nearly 2 years of training at a top gym, he lasted mere seconds against Mickey Gall. We'll take a look ahead to this weekend's UFC Fight Night event in Hidalgo, Texas, as lightweight contenders Dustin Poirier and Michael Johnson look to push themselves forward. We'll bring you our picks for that main event bout. And we've been inundated with questions from you, the listeners, this week, and we'll answer the very best ones right here on this week's show. My name's Simon Head, MMA reporter for The Sun here in the UK, and joining me via Skype is my podcasting partner in crime, Mr. Shamakar Sandhu, who you can find on MMA Junkie, Flow Combat and Fighters Only. But more importantly than all of that, you can find him every week right here as one half of the Brit Pack. Sandhu, how's it going, buddy?
I'm not too bad, Sire, but a pretty good weekend. And by that, I mean, before a UFC 203 kicked off, I actually got about 3 or 4 hours kip, which isn't normally the case. I try and get some sleep before a fight night, because otherwise, we're up until 5, 6 in the morning. And perhaps, listeners of ours, across the UK can really relate to that. That's part and parcel of the gig, being a fan of the sport and watching it on a weekly basis. But that for me was a big victory side, to get 3-4 hours sleep, and it meant that I didn't have to do too much catching up last night and hopefully tonight. So that was good. And I also got verified on Twitter, so I finally caught up to the likes of yourself and many others. I've got the blue tick, the check mark on Twitter, so now everyone knows that I am who I say I am. So that was a nice little tick of the box, no pun intended. But no, apart from that, I'm doing well, mate. Looking forward to kind of speaking all things mixed martial arts, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about this week.
We certainly do. And on the topic of managing to get sleep before the event, I always try and do that, and without fail, I never get it done. I always end up getting caught up doing something else, or there's something on early in the evening I end up watching, or it could be anything. I mean, this weekend it was the Kell Brook fight, Kell Brook versus Golovkin. Fantastic fight. Kell Brook did really well in that fight, actually, until he sustained a broken orbital and ended up his corner saved him. But so I ended up staying up. I did about 27 hours straight, and predictably I was an absolute mess by Sunday afternoon. So I really need to sort that out. I'll be really interested to know, actually, of our British listeners out there. How do you guys actually do this? How do you consume live UFC events? Are you one of these hardcore nutcases who stays up all the way through the night? Or are you a bit more sensible and get sleep in beforehand? Or do you avoid the spoilers, wake up early Sunday morning and watch the fights then? It's not easy being a UK MMA fan when there's big events the other side of the planet. So chuck us a tweet at the Brit Pack MMA. Let us know how you watch these big live UFC events. I'd be really interested to know. And as you say, Sandhu, we had some, we've got loads to talk about this week. Let's kick it right off with UFC 203 and that main event over there in Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio's own Stipe Miocic getting that big knockout against Alistair Overeem. I flip-flopped. I changed my pick really late. I was going to go with Stipe. I've been saying he's the guy to beat for weeks and weeks and weeks. I changed my pick with about 3 days to go and put the curse on Alistair Overeem, who nearly did exactly what I predicted. I said he'd knock him down. I said he'd get a submission. But he didn't quite finish it off, did he? And Stipe got out of that guillotine choke and went on to knock out the Reem and retain that UFC heavyweight title.
Yeah, I actually saw you flip-flop a little bit. After our kind of talk last week, I thought you were dead set on sticking with Miocic, but then I saw you kind of slightly kind of move towards Overeem, and nothing fight week really kind of gave me the sense that I would change my pick with Overeem, and I was literally just about to type, here we go, we've got a fourth European UFC champion, how times have changed. As soon as he clipped Miocic, I thought it was going to be a wrap, and I think it's at critical times in a fight which kind of separate not the boys from the men. That's the wrong analogy here, but from the champions to the pretenders to the throne. Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it, because Overeem clipped him, Miocic went down, and then he had a decision to make. And in hindsight, being what it is, I think he'll regret not swarming him, getting on top of him, and putting in some ground and pound, which I think would have given him a much better chance to end the fight there and then. But like you said, he went in for the guillotine choke. He never really had it all the way in, cinched in, and eventually Miocic was able to escape. And then obviously we saw the fight play out as it did, and Miocic, got the job done in the end, by knockout. But it was a fantastic kind of almost a crescendo to the night, especially for Miocic being in Cleveland. It was immensely loud. I know some of our reporter friends who were on the scene there compared it to the Dublin show, which rang higher on the decibel meter. But I think it was a nice moment for Stipe, getting that opportunity to fight in his hometown and getting the big win. So that was really nice to see. But what did you make of the whole scenario side between Joe Rogan and Overeem? That seems to be another big hot talking point coming out of the fight, where essentially Overeem had said that he had felt a tap. Joe Rogan threw it to the replay, which clearly didn't show any tap. And then there was some obviously controversy coming out with Joe Rogan, not only the broadcast, but then on social media, basically saying that he's spoken to the UFC and he's kind of advised them and said he doesn't feel as though he should be, or the UFC or anyone should be, interviewing a fighter immediately after a loss like that, after he's just been concussed essentially by a knockout. What did you make of that whole scenario?
Yeah, it was a bizarre one. I mean, the thing to bear in mind with all this, Reem was out cold. He got knocked out cold by Stipe, and then he came to, and I can only imagine what happens to you when you lose a fight like that, and you're trying to piece everything together in your mind. You're looking for reasons. You're looking for reasons why you lost, and unfortunately for Overeem, they threw straight to the truck and put the replay up on the screen, which in hindsight wasn't the best scenario for Alistair, who obviously got hung out to dry a little bit by all that. And the longer it went on, because obviously they went for a second angle, and it just got worse. It was all very awkward. I do totally agree with what Joe Rogan said. If you've been knocked out, you shouldn't be conducting interviews afterwards, because let's face it, you're in no position to give a real opinion of what happened, because you've just been concussed enough to be separated from your senses. So, really there shouldn't be that. Those guys shouldn't be put in front of a microphone at that point. So I wouldn't hold anything against Alistair for what he said. I don't think he was trying to belittle Stipe's win. I just think that it was probably a case of a concussed fighter desperately looking for a reason why he might have lost. And he said what he said. I'm sure looking back at it now, he's probably feeling a little awkward about the whole situation himself. And it'd be interesting to see where Alistair Overeem goes from here, because this was his big moment, and he was so close to getting it done. And I do completely agree with you that, and obviously hindsight's 20/20, isn't it? But yeah, I tend to agree with you that if he'd have just made that split-second decision the other way and gone for ground and pound, I tend to agree with you. I think he may well have got that fight finished by going for the choke. Stipe wasn't taking any more blows to the head, and I think it probably wouldn't have taken too many more for ref Mark Goddard to have stepped in and finished that fight, because clearly that big straight left from Alistair did the job and knocked him flat. And rather than lock up the guillotine, which can be a tricky submission to finish at the best of times, it's not a painful submission as such. It's not like an arm bar where you're dealing with the pain. It's just a blood choke. So the worst thing that's going to happen to you in those sort of situations is you pass out. So as a fighter, you can potentially fight through those a lot more easily than, say, a well applied arm bar or something like that. So That's an interesting angle to look at as well. So it was one of those that, unless you get it on really, really good and you're prepared to choke the guy unconscious, sometimes, most fight cards you see people go for a guillotine and not finish it, just because it's such a tough submission to finish at the very highest level. You've got to get it on absolutely perfectly, and you've got to get it locked up really tight so the guy literally can't escape, and you need enough time in the round. So didn't go over his way. Miocic got the knockout. The crowd went nuts. People comparing it to Dublin, which you wouldn't have thought people would be comparing Cleveland to Dublin going into that weekend. But there we have it. Jessica Ai's walkout I thought was amazing. It sounded like a main event when she was walking out. It was great. Unfortunately for her, she didn't get the performance that she was hoping for as she lost to Betch Correia. But obviously Stipe was the man they're all talking about. Let's quickly talk about that main event. The co-main event, Sandhu. One of the more bizarre fights we've seen in the UFC heavyweight division, and they do sometimes throw up a few weird ones. But Fabricio Werdum, I think, was really looking for a really decisive performance against Travis Browne, and came flying out the blocks with this flying push kick to the head, which he's done before. Actually, he did it in Pride. He obviously didn't get the finish from that, and then the fight just sort of deteriorated, and it kind of just sort of petered out to a unanimous decision. I mean, what did you make of that contest? It was a bit of a weird one.
Yeah, it had pretty much everything but the kitchen sink in that fight. So you like you mentioned it, Si. You come up with this flying kick, which started off the fight with a bang, so to speak, and I thought that was going to rock Travis Browne to the point where perhaps Werdum could follow up with some more strikes and finish it there and then. But Browne kind of steadied the ship, so to speak, and from there, I mean, in the first round, you had a moment where Browne injured his hand, and later we find out it ended up being a broken finger. And the referee, Gary Copeland, who, by the way, looks like a 5-foot version of Brock Lesnar and wears his T-shirts maybe 3 or 4 sizes too small, Gary Copeland calls a timeout, Si. He calls a timeout, which is absolutely, unforgivable. Like, you're not supposed to do that. I mean, if the fighter's injured and he's calling a timeout or he's turned his back to his opponent, that's it. TKO, you lose the fight. But they call a stop to the action. They call the doctors in. They have a kind of word with Travis Browne. They kind of look at his hand, and bizarrely they allow the fight to continue. And then the fight plays out, as it does. Browne somehow, I don't know how, ends up continuing to carry on fighting, even though he's got a bone sticking out of his skin. Then throughout the fight, as each round ended, you've got Browne going back to his corner, and you've got Edmund Tarverdyan, who was screaming at the top of his lungs, at the top of his voice, at one point losing his voice, just screaming all sorts of expletives. And I don't know how or why he was doing that, and what kind of motivation or strategy or help he was actually giving Browne by acting the way he did in between those rounds. The fight ends. Werdum gets the unanimous decision, and then there's an altercation between him and Tarverdyan, where apparently, Tarverdyan, says something to Werdum about his mother, and again, I'm sure there were some expletives involved there, and then Werdum kicks him. He gives him a bit of a push kick, and then all hell breaks loose, and then the commission come in and they kind of take Tarverdyan and Browne and that whole camp out of the octagon. And then later in the post-fight press conference and post-fight interviews, we find out that 2 hours before the fight, Werdum had actually taken a cortisone shot because 3 weeks ago he had broken or fractured his foot, which just makes his performance and that flying kick at the start even more bizarre, because how the hell did he even get through 15 minutes where he did throw a few kicks? It was, I don't know what to make of it. So it was just absolutely crazy. There's so many talking points, and we can record a whole show just based on that. But I do think that had it been perhaps maybe a John Kavanagh, maybe a Faraz Zahabi that Werdum had kicked, then I think the MMA community would have been, up in arms. But I think because it was Edmund Tarverdyan, he's not, I suppose, the most well-liked figure in the sport, that I think a lot of people maybe gave him the pass, and maybe that's why it's not too much of a hot topic, or Verdum's not getting too much heat for it. But I mean, like I said, so much crazy stuff went on in that fight. I mean, ultimately Verdum came out the winner. It's not a performance or a victory that I feel as though is going to secure him a title shot, even though he thinks he deserves it next. But it's another win nonetheless.
Yeah, and I have to say, what Verdum did is pretty unforgivable. You can't be doing stuff like that in the octagon. That's ridiculous. He's a former heavyweight world champion. He's one of the most experienced guys in the UFC heavyweight division, and he completely lost the plot. It'd be very interesting to see if he gets any punishment either from the UFC or from the Ohio State Commission. But you can't be going around doing that. Whether it's a crackpot coach like Edmund Tarverdyan, or whether it's John Kavanagh or Greg Jackson or whoever it is, you can't be behaving like that. It's nuts. As for Edmund himself, I mean, he's a walking, talking soap opera, isn't he? It's just everything he does, people are obviously fixated on what he does because he's one of the sport's great eccentrics. He obviously got his notoriety through being in Ronda Rousey's corner. It's noticeable, in my opinion, that Travis Browne looks an absolute shadow of the guy who ripped through the heavyweight division and got to the point where he was one fight away from a title shot. He doesn't look like the same guy anymore. He was an absolute wrecking machine in that heavyweight division. I remember that flying Superman punch knockout of Stefan Struve. An absolute standout moment. His finish of Alistair Overeem absolutely ruined him to the body. And then he basically soaked up everything that he had, then turned around, hit him with a couple of straight body kicks, then moved one to the chin, knocked out Overeem. One of the most incredible comeback wins we've seen in recent years in the UFC heavyweight division. But he looks a completely different animal right now, and it is hard not to question Tarverdyan's credibility. Just look at the results and look at the success of his fighters post Ronda Rousey Holly Holm. So since that fight, we haven't really seen too much of positive results from him. So it'd be interesting to see where he goes, whether Travis Browne looks to stay with the Glendale Fighting Club. I mean, obviously he's in a relationship with Ronda, so maybe that has something to do with it as well. But yeah, it's a weird one. But on Verdum, you can't go around doing stuff like that. That's ridiculous. We'll move on from that to another rather bizarre event, which is the welterweight clash between Mickey Gall and Mr. Phil Brooks, better known to the wider world as CM Punk. And it's the fight that a lot of people were waiting for one of two reasons. Either they wanted to see him get in there and see how he got on, or and I would count an awful lot of people within the MMA media in this latter category. They're waiting for him to go in there and get his backside handed to him. And that's pretty much what happened. He walked straight up to Mickey Gall, attempted to throw some sort of right hand. I watched it on replay, and it barely qualified as a punch. It was almost like he was pushing. It was almost like he was doing the shot put. He was almost pushing his hand out there. But Gall had already shot underneath, took him down, and the next time CM Punk stood up, the fight was over. So it was as convincing. It reminded me in some ways. You remember when James Toney fought Randy Couture, and Randy Couture just took him down, worked his position, and finished him. It had shades of that about it, but obviously Randy Couture is a very seasoned fighter. I think he was 47 years of age when he, or 46 years of age when he fought James Toney. A lot of fights under his belt, two-weight world champion. This is 2-0 Mickey Gall, and basically did the same job on CM Punk. The thing that stood out to me was, and I wrote about it on the Sun website today. I did a little opinion piece. He came into this event with not one game plan, but two game plans. One was to beat CM Punk and how he would go about that. The second game plan was what he would do when he got the mic. And boy, did he make that mic time count. He did the perfect call out by calling out Sage Northcutt. That is the perfect possible matchup for him. What did you make of that fight, first off, if you can call it a fight? And what did you make of Mickey Gall in his post-fight comments? And also CM Punk after the fight?
Yeah, I mean, I tweeted about this just prior to the fight kicking off. It's very rare, if ever at all, that I'm as conflicted as I was trying to be a completely down the middle, unbiased journalist, just calling the action as I see, and also emotionally reacting to the fight as I'm watching it on TV. I've made no secret about it. I'm a lifelong pro wrestling fan. I was a pro wrestling fan way before I was an MMA fan, and a part of the reason I became a fan of mixed martial arts was because of pro wrestling. And I've been a CM Punk pro wrestler fan for a long, long time. I've been following his career for ages. I've been to plenty of, Raws and WrestleManias and all sorts of events. Largely part of, especially over the last kind of decade, due to him. He's been the bright shining star of a lackluster period for the WWE over the last decade. Now things have changed there in the last kind of couple of years, with a lot of young talent finally being given the push. But to see him make the walk, it's been a few years since Cult of Personality hit. I'm not going to lie, Simon. I popped pretty hard when I heard that song hit, and it was pretty cool to see him, make that walk to the octagon. But for the life of me, Simon, I just can't understand why he tried to bum rush Mickey Gall and just kind of throw a weird punch as he's stepping forward. I thought, take your time, give it 30 seconds, 45 seconds, give it a minute, maybe bounce around the octagon for a bit, figure out your range, settle into the fight a little bit, feel out Gall. But it was just completely, I want to call it an amateur mistake. He is an amateur, really, isn't he? This is his first professional fight. He never even got a chance to showcase any of the hard work he's put in over the last 18 months to 2 years, showcase any of the skill set that he's gained and picked up and learned while during his time at Rufus Sport. He didn't give a good account of himself, and he's only got himself to blame. Again, we talked about it earlier on at the very top level with decision making. Even at the bottom level, you've got to just make the basic right decisions, and he made a schoolboy error just trying to rush Mickey Gall, who is very, very good with his ground game. That's the one part of the game I think pretty much everyone knew. He's got a really good ground game. He's good at his jiu-jitsu, and like you said, he took him down, and he got the job done. And I thought he'd do it. I think many thought he would do it, and I completely agree with you, Simon. The absolute perfect call out. What we've got now with him calling out Sage Northcutt is, and again, I tweeted this about Gall, and I got a little bit of flack about it, but not too much. I thought, here's a rookie who is well prepared. He was fighting on the regional circuit. There was an opportunity to fight in front of Dana White. What does he do? He calls out CM Punk. Next thing you know, he's got a UFC contract. He's fighting on a pay-per-view main card, right? What does he do in this moment? He calls out Sage Northcutt. Fantastic. Both guys with a background coming off the show looking for a fight, which has been really the UFC's kind of big hit show this year. We talked about it last week, Si, with The Ultimate Fighter, perhaps definitely not being what it used to be. But in saying that, the UFC have created a show in looking for a fight that has generated fighters that have got piqued people's interest, right, at a minimum. But also they've created genuine stars and draws in now Mickey Gall and prior to him Sage Northcutt. I think it's a great fight. I sent a tweet to Eric Winter, who's the head of Fight Pass, just kind of throwing it out there. I said, hey Eric, how about Mickey Gall, Sage Northcutt as the Fight Pass featured prelim for UFC 205 in New York? And I hope to make it. I know I saw an interview post-fight with Megan O'Leary where Dana White had said that following the call-out, Sage Northcutt, his management or his people, had kind of reached out to Dana White saying that they're interested in the fight. What weight they do it at will be interesting. Obviously, Mickey Gall fights at 170. Sage Northcutt fights at 155. I don't know if they do it at one weight or another, or if it's just a catch weight just to get the fight put together. But 100%, I completely agree with you, Si. It was the right call to make. Now, with CM Punk, it's very interesting to see what happens next. In his post-fight press conference, he said he wants to fight again, Simon. Dana White said that perhaps his next fight shouldn't be in the UFC. Now, this might cause a bit of an issue. I guess the UFC will wait to find out what the pay-per-view numbers are like. But if they cut him, Si, surely Bellator will be knocking on his door, right?
Yeah, of course they will. Of course they will. But I think if the UFC were going to keep him around, there's one guy who they could put him in with, and that's Mike Jackson. They could get Mike Jackson. Mickey Gall polished him off pretty quickly as well. The thing with Mike Jackson, he sold the hell out of his fight with Mickey Gall. Did a really good job. Was great fun promotionally. But let's be honest here, CM Punk talent-wise has no business being anywhere near the UFC octagon. Now he was given this opportunity, and he himself admitted that he was looking to go into MMA at a low level and learn his trade, but was offered this opportunity and took it. I don't think there's a fighter on the planet who wouldn't have taken that opportunity. Now,
of course not. You can't blame him. He just got before the show started today. The Ohio State Athletic Commission released the numbers. Simon, he made $500,000.
Yeah, I mean it is the biggest no-brainer going. Now, having been in there and done it, and basically come up incredibly short in terms of talent and performance in the octagon, the big decision now is, what do I do next? If I think what he probably should do is drop down and maybe go fight for someone like Legacy or RFA, get put in there with some young prospects who are just making their way in the game, and do that. Be on a platform that is still on Fight Pass. That would probably make the most sense. Work with the UFC to work with one of their subsidiary promotional partners on Fight Pass, so that they still get the benefit of CM Punk fighting on a UFC platform, so that he can still be on UFC Fight Pass, but it's just he'll do it on one of the regional shows, and I think that makes the most sense. It continues his story, it allows him to continue his career. Continue to progress his new career that he wants to make in MMA. But do it at a more appropriate level for his abilities. This for me was a one-shot deal. I don't have any issue with the fact that it happened because of the way it happened. And I think the biggest thing that comes out of this, it builds Mickey Gall. And I think that is probably the biggest takeaway out of all of this, is the fact that what we have here is a young, articulate, smart fighter who is very, very young in his career. But he shows that he gets it. He understands what's going on. He's got some credentials behind him in terms of, he's a brown belt in jiu-jitsu. He's still developing his game, and he needs to now take fights that are commensurate to his talent level. And that's why calling out Sage Northcutt was absolutely the perfect thing to do. I think they'll make that fight at 170. Sage has had a fight or two at 170. He's a big 55er anyway. And we are beginning to see fighters start to move towards fighting at their more natural weight. I don't think Sage will have any issue at all taking that fight at 170. And I think it's the perfect fight for the pair of them. I think Sage has kind of found his level a little bit. Now he needs to find a dance partner that's going to bring the best out of him. And I think you've got this interesting clash of personalities. They've both come through the same route, but personality-wise, they couldn't be any different. And I'm looking forward to that fight, and I really do hope that they make it for 205 in New York, or maybe even the Vegas show in December, on December the 30th. One of those two shows. And I completely agree with you, and I wrote about it as well and said exactly the same as you. That is the perfect fight to be a Fight Pass prelim. They were made on UFC Fight Pass. They've come through the system, if you like, via UFC Fight Pass, and now here they are, the two biggest names to come up through that show so far, head to head as the featured Fight Pass prelim on a huge blockbuster show like UFC 205. It makes perfect sense. That's what I would do. I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and I completely agree with your point about the personalities. What you've got here is you've got a clean-cut, blonde hair, blue-eyed boy next door in Sage Northcutt, who's probably every 15, 16-year-old girl's kind of pin-up poster, boy band lookalike type of guy. versus a New Jersey dark-haired, foul-mouthed Mickey Gall, who was just effing and blinding in his post-fight interview. And if they put the fight together, so I really can't wait until these guys are, starting to do the pre-fight interviews and they start to face off and there's a press conference. But I really like Mickey Gall. I like everything he's done so far with all of the opportunities he's been given. I like the fact that he's got something prepared to say in case he wins a fight, which is great because, like Chael Sonnen always said, you've got to always be thinking ahead. Sonnen was the master at it. He'd win a fight and then he'd have something ready to set up the next fight. You've always got to keep people interested in what you're going to do next. And Mickey Gall's definitely doing that. In the limited amount of action we've seen him in, although maybe the competition has been up to his level, he's proven to be as clinical as he can be. And at the end of the day, you can only kind of beat whoever's in front of you. So I think with this whole kind of CM Punk experiment, if you want to call it that, whatever happens with CM Punk, at least the UFC during the process have been able to create a star. If you want to maybe perhaps call him a star, maybe he's not a star yet, but he's certainly on his way. In Mickey Gall, where he's got name value now, people know who he is. There's genuine interest in him, and I'm looking forward to seeing his career develop in front of our very eyes for the biggest promotion in the world.
Yeah, totally agree, and it's going to be very interesting to see if they make that fight. And I just wonder, is Mickey Gall the guy who finally breaks this happy-go-lucky facade of Sage Northcutt, who, try as the media might, we've asked him repeatedly, what pisses you off, Sage? Something must annoy you. Even if you stub your toe going into your house, or you shut your finger in the door, something must annoy you. And he's giving us nothing back. He's like, no, I'm happy with everything. Everything's great. Everything's awesome. Maybe it needs another young prospect to get in his face and really, really push his buttons, just to see. Let's see if that Sage Northcutt mask slips at all during the build-up. I'm fascinated by it. I'm sort of thinking about the clash in personalities between the two. Mm-hmm. I'm really looking forward to the fight, and they haven't even made it yet. So fingers crossed they get it done. As you say, Dana says they're going to get it done. So it's just a case of when that fight takes place. But 205 would make the most sense to me. Get it done for Madison Square Garden. That would be absolutely perfect. Very, very quickly, we'll just run through a couple of the other key results on that fight card. Sure. Jimmy Rivera putting in a very controlled, very disciplined performance to defeat Uriah Faber. Without doubt, the biggest win of his UFC career. Extended that ridiculous unbeaten run of his, and he's probably 1 or 2 fights away from being discussed as a legitimate threat for that bantamweight championship. Jessica Andrade really putting the hurting on Joanne Calderwood. She didn't even give her the chance to settle. Took her down, submitted her inside a round. Really disappointing for JoJo. To be honest, 125-pound division cannot come quickly enough for Joanne Calderwood. I think that's her perfect fit. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, actually, we've got some questions on both the Rivera-Faber fight and the Andrade-Calderwood fight. So without going into too much detail on both of them, I agree with you, Simon. I think Calderwood, ideal, her weight class is 125. But in the current weight division that she's fighting in strawweight, it is what it is. Calderwood does need to work on her ground game. She needs to work on her wrestling. That's been no secret. She comes from a Muay Thai striking background, so that was always going to be her strongest point. And she's taken the loss on the chin. Looking at and reading her social media, she's going to go back to the gym, start working on what the improvements they need to work on. And who knows, maybe the Belfast card might be a good shout if she wants to try and get one more fight to round out the year. It'll give her a chance to perhaps spend a little bit more time maybe at home. It wouldn't be too much of a struggle or too far for some of her local fans in Scotland and friends and family to hop across the pond and make it to Belfast. And as for Rivera, I mean, wow. I mean, this guy is legitimately. I mean, he wasn't ranked in the top 10, which is bizarre. And I guess it just shows the strength of the bantamweight division in 2016 heading into this fight. But I'm sure he'll skyrocket into that top 10 following this fight for sure. It's the first time Faber's suffered back-to-back losses, and He's well into his late 30s now. So I guess the best thing for him to do now is just to take some time off, reevaluate things, and he's still got some big marquee fights and big money fights out there available for him. But I guess he needs to figure out what he wants. I think had he beaten Rivera, it would have been another case of here he goes again. Faber's going to start another win streak, 3 or 4 wins, and he'll put himself back into title contention. But that's not the case. He suffered a loss against one of the youngest and best in that division, in Jimmy Rivera. Some called it a passing of the torch, so to speak. But yeah, Faber, he needs to figure out what he wants to do. He's luckily for him, over the course of his career, he's been able to get a lot of businesses set up outside of the sport. I'm sure he'll be fine financially. I guess he needs to figure out if he's still got the hunger, determination to want to train and compete with the very best, and see what kind of matches the UFC potentially offer him. But overall, Si, it was a very entertaining main card to UFC 203. It was a bit of the good, the bad, and the ugly at some points. But it's definitely one that had plenty of talking points. And for us in the media, I guess that's pretty much what you want. You want to come out of these cards with lots to discuss, lots to debate, and that's what we got on Saturday night.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final mention before we move on to the coming weekend's card. Mention for Drew Dober, who I think put on probably the most impressive performance on the prelims. Really, really put it to Jason Gonzalez. Spectacular knockout performance from him. Obviously, Drew Dober, we know him. He fought Nick Hein in Germany. After that fight, he ended up meeting a girl. That girl was Nick Hein's sister. They've since got married. So we've got this weird situation where these two guys who used to fight against each other in the UFC are now brothers-in-law, which is kind of cool. But yeah, he put on probably the best performance of his UFC career on Saturday. So all credit to Drew Dober winning that fight by knockout in 1 minute 45 seconds against Jason Gonzalez. That was a tough introduction to UFC life for him. Let's kick things on to this coming weekend, UFC Fight Night in Hidalgo, Texas. Obviously, we've had some very big, strong fight cards in recent weeks. This one, perhaps not quite as strong, but we've got in Dustin Poirier versus Michael Johnson, a really exciting main event. I think we've got two of the lightweight division's best stylists in terms of their striking and in terms of their all-action style. I can't see this fight being anything but a barn burner. I really do think it's going to be a fantastic matchup. What I wanted to do, Sandhu, I just wanted to get your take on that fight. Give us a prediction on that one. I'll chuck my 2 pence worth in, and we'll kick things on from there. But I think, we've got ourselves an exciting lightweight fight on the top of that fight card, Poirier versus Johnson.
Yeah, stylistically, it should be a barn burner, like you said. But when it comes to records, this is quite an interesting fight because you've got Dustin Poirier, who essentially, since losing to Conor McGregor, has really just kicked on. He jumped up to lightweight following the loss to Conor McGregor at featherweight. And since then, he's kind of racked up a pretty decent win streak with the likes of Yancy Medeiros, Joseph Duffy, and most recently, Bobby Green in his list of victims. But on the flip side, you've got Michael Johnson, who's had back-to-back losses. So he last time we saw him in action was last December when he lost to Nate Diaz, and obviously Nate Diaz went on to give that now infamous speech where he kind of called out Conor McGregor, and that was kind of used heavily in all of the promotion leading up to UFC 196. So I'll be interested to see what kind of Michael Johnson we see and what kind of improvements he's made, because a loss here, Si, and he'll be 0-3 in his last 3, and typically with a lot of other fighters that's a call to perhaps get cut. Now, I don't think if he loses, he'll get cut. I think he's quite lucky and fortunate that the UFC have put him in a main event slot here for this fight night card. So it's a massive opportunity, a massive stage. But I think the fighter with the most upside to win here is Dustin Poirier. Looking at the actual rankings, he's at number 7 now. And, the lightweight division seems to be a little bit jammed because you've got fighters like Khabib Nurmagomedov, who's obviously fought very inconsistently over the last couple of years due to injury. Obviously, we've got Adi Alvarez now, who's a champion, but I suppose is trying to kind of wrangle his way into that Conor McGregor money fight, so to speak, at UFC 205. So I think there's plenty of time and opportunity for Poirier, if he is to get a win on the weekend, to then kick on from there and maybe get a fight with maybe the top 2 or 3 fighters in that division, which could then put him into title contention further down the road. But in regards to a pick, I think just given his hot streak lately, and because we haven't really seen too much of Michael Johnson since that loss to Diaz over the course of the last 9 months, I'm going to go for Poirier just due to his performances and the level of consistency that he's shown over the course of the last kind of couple of years since that loss to McGregor.
I have to agree with you. I think Michael Johnson, I think the most interesting thing about this fight is since he's moved to lightweight, Dustin Poirier has looked like a completely different animal. He was always an exciting fighter who liked to stand and trade, but at lightweight he just seems to have picked up this additional power, and he took Yancy Medeiros apart back in June. He knocked out Carlos Diego Ferreira, and he knocked out Bobby Green. These are all good, solid operators, and he's finished them all. I mean, Joe Duffy he took to a decision. That was a great fight, and Duffy, I think, gets a lot of credit out of that fight, even though he ended up on the wrong end of the decision that night. But the thing I'm most interested in here is how the striking goes, because Michael Johnson is an excellent technical striker. He's got great footwork. He's got good technical boxing skills. And he's never ever been stopped by strikes. He's only ever been stopped inside the distance by submission. So will this be the first time he gets stopped by strikes? If Dustin Poirier can finish Michael Johnson inside the distance by KO or TKO, I think that really does send a message to the rest of that lightweight division that we've got a serious contender on our hands. I believe he is a serious contender, and I think if he gets past Michael Johnson on Saturday night, I expect to see him in a contender fight. Maybe the likes of Tony Ferguson or someone like that could be next for him. I think, as you say, the permutations are almost endless in that lightweight division. There are so many good fighters. Anyone in that top 10, you could just put 2 of them against each other, and you're going to get a great fight. And I think Poirier is moving his way up the ranks. I think he's going to win the fight. I do think he's going to win it inside the distance as well. I think this could, as if he isn't already regarded as one of the hottest prospects at 155, I think this really could cement him as a bona fide contender for that lightweight title. I'm picking him to win inside the distance. I think it's going to be a really, really interesting main event in Hidalgo, Texas on Saturday night, which you'll be able to watch here in the UK live on BT Sport. Check your listings. If it's the same time as usual, it'll be 1 a.m. start on BT Sport 2, main card 3 a.m. Maybe an hour earlier than that, because they're in Texas rather than all the way across on the West Coast. So check your listings.
I really hope so, Si. I really hope so.
Anything that
because
gets,
it's not the sexiest card in the world.
Anything that and it's on Fox as well, so you can, we're going to get a lot of ad breaks. So that's the one unfortunate thing about this. So, but it is what it is. But it's one of those events where you need the coffee, you need the snacks, and you need some staying power, because I think once you get to that main event, I think it'll pay you back. I think you'll get your just reward for sticking it out all the way to the main event. So co-main event's an interesting one. Uriah Hall versus Derek Brunson as well. I'm looking forward to that one. But that's UFC Fight Night in Hidalgo, Texas, at the State Farm Arena, Saturday night, BT Sport 2, and obviously the prelims will be available to you, of course, and as always, on UFC Fight Pass. That takes us to our Q&A part of the show, which Sandhu told me before we went live that we need to leave a little bit of breathing room for this, because we've had quite a few questions this week. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I have to say, Si, I think this is becoming probably my favourite part of the show. I know we're only like 7 or 8 shows in to the Brit Pack, but we're now starting to get overwhelmingly inundated with questions, especially when you and me kind of throw out the call to action and actually ask our fans and listeners to actually to send us some questions. So to everyone that does, we really, really appreciate it. If we don't ask your question, it's probably because we've either already answered it in the various segments of the show, or perhaps somebody else has asked it. But we appreciate you sending in the questions nonetheless. And yeah, I think moving forward, this could probably be a nice large segment of the show, because there's fascinating questions out there, and this is a really good opportunity for both of us to actually kind of get our opinions across and give the fans what they want. So to kick us off, Si, Christopher Smith says, what's next for the heavyweight division? And he thinks it should be Miocic defending his championship against Cain Velasquez. He says JDS versus Verdum 2. And then he says Overeem versus Browne 2. Now, for me, I agree with Miocic versus Velasquez. Personally, I'd like to see Overeem versus Hunt, only because I think that'd be a nice little throwback to the Pride days. But I wouldn't mind Verdum versus Rothwell either, because that was the original co-main event for UFC 203 either. But what do you think, Si, for Miocic, for Verdum, and for Overeem? Who would you match him up with next?
I think Chris has got it nailed pretty much. I think Cain Velasquez has got to fight for the title next. I think his loss to Fabricio Verdum in Brazil, in Mexico, was pretty much an aberration. It was an anomaly. He failed to train properly for that fight in terms of preparing at altitude. It cost him. He came back at UFC 200 and fought like a man possessed against Travis Browne. You compare his performance against Travis Browne at 200 with Fabricio Verdum's performance against the Travis Browne with a busted finger on Saturday night. It's chalk and cheese. It's night and day. They aren't comparable. Velasquez is on a different planet to Verdum when he's on form, in my opinion. He has to fight Stipe next, and I think that would be a fantastic fight. I'm looking forward already to seeing how that one will shake out. In terms of Verdum, I think he needs to drop down the ladder a little bit. He needed to win impressively, and really against a guy who couldn't throw one of his hands effectively. He basically scraped through and got himself a decision. So I wouldn't mind seeing Verdum against Rothwell. I think that's a worthwhile matchup. I'd also chuck the name Derek Lewis into the mix as well. I want to see him against one of the top guys. I don't know who it would be. Maybe even someone like Mark Hunt or someone like that. But I want to see Derek Lewis given a step up in competition. I know he's facing Marcin Tybura next, I believe. I think that's going to be in Manila, which is interesting because we spoke to him in Croatia, and he's not a fan of long haul travel, Derek. So flying to Manila is going to be a fun one for him. But and Marcin Tybura, if he gets through Marcin Tybura, I want to see him in there with one of the very top guys. I think they need to start pushing some of these young guns. The other guy I want to see given a bit of a push is Francis Ngannou. He's someone who I think could really become a sort of a terrifying force in that UFC heavyweight division. I'd like to see him in there. If Overeem wants to keep fighting, maybe stick him in with the Reem. I think that would be stylistically quite an interesting fight to watch, and a really good test to see where the ceiling is for the big Frenchman. So I think there's a few fights you can make just below championship level. There's a few different permutations there. Mark Hunt needs a fight. Ben Rothwell deserves a good fight. Obviously he was due to fight this weekend and missed out through injury. But when we're talking about the championship, I think Chris has got it absolutely nailed. Cain Velasquez has to be next.
Absolutely. RG tweets in and says, what are your views on Coach Edmund's motivational words during the break between rounds? Well, look, I'm not sure what impact, Simon, it had on Browne, but it was really bizarre. Just screaming at the top of his lungs and swearing, and in general giving Travis Browne a dressing down, when perhaps some actual fight strategy would have been better, and just keeping Browne focused at the task at hand after what was a very strange, event-filled opening round anyway. Tarverdyan, like I said earlier in the show, definitely isn't a fan favourite amongst the MMA community, but that's beside the point. I think Browne may take a closer look at this fight and his head coach, who he puts all of his trust in with regards to advice between rounds and reassess things moving forward. At the end of the day, that's the fighter's responsibility. They choose where they train and who they select as their cornerman on fight night. But I mean, what was your take on Coach Edmund's kind of, as RG puts it, motivational words during in between the rounds?
Right, well, let me play devil's advocate just for literally a few seconds here before I tell you what I think. Everybody reacts differently to motivation. Everyone has their own particular stimulus. Some people like to have an arm round the shoulder and a little bit of mollycoddling and a little bit of gentle encouragement. Other people need to have their arse kicked. And it was pretty clear from the corner that Edmund, at least, believed that Travis needed his arse kicked. And verbally, he certainly delivered that between rounds. Given what we saw, it clearly didn't work. It wasn't like he sent Travis back into action with a flea in his ear and he went and fought like a man possessed, sort of spurred on by Edmund's motivational words. Quite the opposite. That didn't happen at all. So I don't know. I don't know is the short answer. It's hard to look at some of the things that Edmund does and think that he's getting the best out of his fighters that way. I know he got absolutely taken apart by fans and media alike after footage of his advice in the corner during the Ronda Rousey loss to Holly Holm was available, and technically. He just, there was no technical coaching involved, and literally he sat Travis Browne on a stool, shouted at him for a minute, and then sent him back out there again. And it was like, give him something, give him. Even if you give him one piece of information to improve his performance from the last round, everyone has their own way of doing things, and clearly Edmund's way doesn't necessarily fit with most people's view of what would be considered constructive, useful technical coaching. But I don't know, mate. Honestly, I think you could have imagine Travis Browne with a Mark Henry in his corner, or with a Ricky Lundell, or a Greg Jackson, or a John Kavanagh. They would have gone in there. They would have sat him down. They probably would have calmed him down.
Yeah.
They would have got his breathing back to a good level. And then they would have imparted some sort of technical information that would have benefited him in the next round. Edmund did none of that, and Travis lost. So it's obviously not all on the coach, but a fair portion of it is. And I don't think he did his man any favours in that fight.
Yeah, and like you said earlier on the show, Si, I think Travis Browne, once upon a time, he looked like a scary, scary individual, and someone that at one point I think we all thought was going to go all the way to heavyweight championship and perhaps be, the next big superstar and perhaps be the next dominant champion. And ever since moving over to Glendale Fight Club and under Coach Tarverdyan, he just looked like a shadow of his former self. And like I said, Simon, it's up to the fighters. They take responsibility of where they train and who their head coach is and who their cornermen are. And I guess we'll find out. We'll find out in his next fight, what happens, whether he leaves, whether he stays, and whether he has Edmund Tarverdyan in his corner. And even if he does, we'll see if Tarverdyan's going to give him the same kind of Alex Ferguson blow-dry treatment again, or whether he's going to maybe, like you said, Simon, give him some actual technical advice that will be beneficial for him as he kind of comes into his second and third round and so forth. Harjot Sidhu tweets in and says, is Faber nearing the end, or is he taking the toughest of fights to prove his worth? And then in brackets he says, legend, in my opinion, by the way. Well, you're right, Faber is certainly a legend. Is he nearing the end? I think it certainly looks that way for me anyway, Si. I mean, like I said earlier on, he's done everything that there is to do in the sport, bar winning a championship in the UFC. And now he's coming off back-to-back losses, which is the very first time that's happened to him in his long career. So he may need to reevaluate things. Like I said, take some time off, let his body recover. And believe you me, he probably will need some recovery after those leg kicks thrown by Rivera. And see if he wants a couple of more fights, As I mentioned earlier on, there's still some big marquee fights available to him should he wish to continue. Off the top of my head, the TJ Dillashaw fight, has got money written all over it. I know you, Simon, you've wanted to see him fight Brad Pickett for a while. So let's see. But in terms of answering the question, yes, in my opinion, he is nearing the end of his illustrious career. Just not sure he's the type to, want to be or hold the title of gatekeeper, so to speak. What do you think, Si?
Yeah, I think when people say is he finished and all the rest of it, he's still a top level fighter. Let's not make any bones about this. He's still comfortably one of the top 10 in that division. I don't think there's any argument there. The question is, given that he's now beginning to lose to the very top guys in the division, whereas he was one of those guys for a very long time, he's now beginning to lose to these guys. The question for Uriah Faber is he going to be happy campaigning as a gatekeeper or in the middle of that top 10 pack, and maybe not getting the bigger fights anymore? He's a draw. I said, I think on last week's show, I'd like to see him used on international shows more, because he's one of these people. He comes across great in interviews. He's a great character. He's a great talker. He's got an awful amount of respect in the MMA world for his accomplishments, and he's a smart guy. He would be a great fighting ambassador for the UFC, and I'm slightly surprised that they haven't used him internationally more. I think he fought in Manila against Frankie Edgar a while back, but I can't remember him going overseas too many other times under the UFC banner. I'd love to see him fight in Europe. As you say, the Brad Pickett fight I think would be a great fight certainly for the fans over on this side of the pond. But in terms of his championship threat, I think that might be on the wane now. So, question for him is he happy to just continue fighting and picking up a paycheck as one of the top 10, or is he one of these guys who, once he realises that he can't win the title anymore, he's going to just hang his gloves up and go out on his shield? He's a smart guy, Uriah Faber. As I think you said, he's done very well with some businesses outside of the octagon. He's a hugely respected guy within the sport, and I'm sure he'll be successful whatever he turns his hand to after fighting, whether he stays within the sport as a pundit or as a coach, or whether he turns his hand to something else completely different. But that's the question for him. Does he want to keep fighting as a gatekeeper in the top 10? I don't know. I think if there's big fights out there for him, he can get a couple of decent name fights out there, maybe travel a little bit with the UFC, then maybe hang him up after that. I think maybe 3-4 fights, we might see him looking to make a decision after that.
Absolutely. Luke tweets in and says, "Hi, I would like to ask what you think is next for Nick Diaz, and do you see Ronda fighting for the title on her return?" Well, for the first part of the question, for Nick Diaz, I think there's an absolute slew of options on the table. There's rematches with GSP and Carlos Condit. Matt Brown has been a fight that fans have wanted to see, as is Robbie Lawler, another rematch. Michael Bisping has called for a fight with Nick Diaz. Tyron Woodley wants him. Chael Sonnen has called out Nick Diaz. The list just goes on and on. Personally, I'd like to see the Robbie Lawler fight. Diaz hasn't won a fight since BJ Penn at UFC 137 back in October of 2011. That's coming up to 5 years, Simon. And I was at that fight. I was at the Mandalay Bay for UFC 137, BJ Penn versus Nick Diaz. And I can't believe it's been that long ago. I was even covering the sport back then, Simon. That's how long it was. I think Lawler is the fight to go here. It's certainly in the realm of a winnable fight for Nick Diaz. Stylistically, it would get the fans going. It's a rematch, and interesting to note that Lawler just pulled out of the Cerrone fight at UFC 205, which makes me think that perhaps the UFC are changing things around, and maybe perhaps they might be putting him together with Diaz, which would suck to hear if you're Donald Cerrone, as I know he was literally heartbroken to hear that fight was falling apart. But if you've got a list, and I listed there a bunch of fights for Nick Diaz, for me, the Robbie Lawler rematch is right on the top of my list. What's your thoughts on that, Si?
Well, you mentioned the Cerrone Lawler thing. From my understanding, Lawler told Cerrone, he went and met him personally, and met him face to face and said, "Look, I've come to meet you personally because I want to tell you the fight's off." And it sounds like he was still having some problems with his head.
Okay.
So I think there might be some sort of post-concussion stuff going on there. So I don't know whether there's any of that happening, but I think he just needed to rest himself a little bit longer. That was the gist of what Cerrone said. So given that might take Lawler out of the picture potentially, because that would, I think, be most people's number one. Cerrone himself wouldn't be a terrible fight to watch. I think that stylistically would be a lot of fun. I do think
Good call.
I think Nick would be. I think he'd have a reasonable size advantage in that fight. But I mean, Cerrone at 170s looked excellent. So stylistically, two guys who like to stand and bang. I think that would be a cracking fight, and I wouldn't mind seeing that at all. The other fight I would absolutely love to see is the Matt Brown fight. I think Matt Brown always brings it. I think that would be a great fight to watch. Let me chuck another one in the mix. Tim the Dirty Bird Means would be, I think.
Ooh, nice.
I think that would be a fantastic. Stylistically, Tim Means and Nick Diaz, I think they'd take the roof off the place. I really do. I think Means obviously isn't considered by many as a sort of a top 3, top 4 guy, but he's a nasty fighter. I think stylistically, him and Diaz would be superb. The question is, who does Diaz want? Because I think the Diaz brothers have shown over the last few months or so, they're pretty strong negotiators these days, and I think Nick will want a bit as much name recognition on the opposite side of the cage to him when he steps in there for his comeback. So maybe Donald Cerrone might be the one to get that done. I think we'd have some interesting chat between the pair of them during fight week, and I think when the cage door shuts, we'd get an absolute cracker of a fight. So I'll stick my money down and say let's have Donald Cowboy Cerrone versus Nick Diaz. That would be a belter.
I like where your head's at, Si. I love that. I think if the Robbie Lawler fight's not going to happen, scratch everything else that I mentioned. Scratch that list. Let's get Cerrone, Nick Diaz as a part of that UFC 205 offering in New York. I mean, I can't imagine you'd want to have a debut in Madison Square Garden without a Diaz brother on it. But Luke's second part of his question, Simon asks if we see Ronda fighting for a title on her return, and I think that's the way to go. I mean, this build up that's been now literally coming up to a year of Ronda Rousey kind of inactivity in the sport and for the UFC. The longer it kind of builds, the higher the anticipation of her return. And I think Ronda Rousey's return, which now looks like it'll most likely take place in 2017, or either at the end of this year on the New Year's Eve card, or well into 2017, it will no doubt be one of the biggest pay-per-view offerings that the UFC have ever had. Dana White's gone on the record, but I mean, to be fair, he is a promoter, so I'm sure he would say this, that it'll probably break all records. But it's got to be a title fight, regardless of how long she takes. On her return, she's got to fight for the title. She was undefeated. She's only lost once, and that was in a title fight. And I think she's done enough, not just in the UFC, but for women's MMA in general, to deserve a title shot on her return. Would you agree with that, Si?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I also think that they've got little option but to do that, because there is always the danger that if you put her in a fight with a contender and she loses, then your golden goose is gone at that point. So I think to bring her back and not put her in a title fight would be an incredibly risky strategy, unless it was against someone like Cyborg, where you could do that as a separate fight, as a showcase fight, and it would deliver everything you needed. And if she lost in that fight at a catch weight, that wouldn't necessarily affect the championship picture or her ability to then go and fight for the title further down the line. So I think they've got to. I think there's good fights for her. Juliana Pena, I think, would be a good fight for her. I think, a rematch with Kat Zingano would be interesting. I think, obviously, there's the Misha rivalry that could easily be rekindled. But obviously, she wants the championship. And if she's going to fight Amanda Nunes, I think that's an incredibly dangerous fight to come back for. I'd almost be tempted to sit and wait and see how Amanda Nunes gets on in her next title defence. And if she looks as good in her first title defence as she did against Misha Tate, then maybe I'd look to go for perhaps a bigger name, but not a championship fight. And then if she gets through that, then fight for a title. But again, that is so risky. So it's balancing up the need to fight for gold and or to be in what you would call a big money fight. I mean, any fight that Ronda's in is going to be a money fight. But yeah, I'm fascinated to see A, if she even comes back, and B, if she does, who it will be against. I'll tell you what will be very interesting, and maybe I'll try and find this out before the next show. Try and find a bookmaker who will give me odds on who will make their comeback first, whether it's Ronda Rousey or George St. Pierre. Because I don't know. I think we'll see GSP before we see Ronda. What do you reckon?
Well, I think one piece of information that came out over the course of the last week since we last recorded the show, Simon, is that Ronda Rousey got tested by USADA, and that's the first time she's had a test in around 6 months. So I know that GSP is also currently in the USADA testing pool, so he's getting tested, and for him it's probably it's a better indication that he might be coming back soon because of his long hiatus. He was on an older UFC contract, and you've got to be sort of in the USADA testing pool for about 4 months before you can actually compete and fight for the UFC again. So if that's an indication of them both returning pretty soon, that's something that maybe some people can kind of take with a pinch of salt. But if I'm going to put my money on someone returning before the other person, I'd put my money on GSP. Only because they've got that Toronto card. They still haven't announced a main event for that Toronto card on December 10th. And I mean, I don't think you can go to... They just lost Rory McDonald to Bellator, so, the only other, Canadian star you've got is George St. Pierre. Now, they could give that Toronto card and stack it with other marquee fighters. And then, they've gone there before with Alexander Gustafsson and John Jones. But right now, John Jones is technically out of the picture until we find out otherwise. But yeah, if I'm going to put my money on someone, and if you get some odds back from the bookmakers, let me know, because I'd put my money on GSP.
Fantastic. Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It's certainly going to make things a lot more interesting if the pair of them come back. You think you've got Conor McGregor doing incredible business at the box office. Nate Diaz is a bona fide superstar now. His brother's on the comeback trail. He's every bit the star as well. Throw GSP in the mix. Throw Ronda Rousey in the mix. And all of a sudden, the new owners of the UFC are going to start looking at their investment and start thinking, right, we can make some serious gains right now. So, sport like this needs stars, and the thought of these guys all coming back to the mothership, so to speak, it's going to make for a very exciting end to 2016, and hopefully a very exciting 2017.
Absolutely. Hendo, and it's not Dan Henderson, but I think his Twitter handle is Ian Hendo. But anyway, Hendo tweets in and says, with Jojo Calderwood losing to a smaller woman, is there any merit in her going up in weight to 125, 135? We briefly spoke about this earlier on, Si. Ideally, she should be fighting at 125 pounds, and it's just unfortunate for her and for other women, both in the bantamweight and strawweight division, that the option just doesn't currently exist right now. And it may not exist for another year or two. I think for Calderwood, she just needs to work on her wrestling, her takedown defense, her ground game. We know she's a good striker and can handle herself on her feet. It's just when she's taken down, that's where the problems start to arise. And when you come up against a short, stocky fighter like Andrade, who has that lower center of gravity, you just know at some point that double leg is coming. But to answer the question, yes, of course, she should be fighting at 125. Maybe the UFC can put together a few more one-off 125 fights. They can certainly do that. They don't need a division to give her the fights for the time being, and just try and let her kind of develop and round out her skill set. If they can do that for her, fantastic. But here's hoping that the 125 division is created sooner rather than later, not just for Joanne Calderwood, but for other fighters as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think Joanne Calderwood at 125 is going to be much happier at the weight class. I know I spoke to her before the fights and this past week, and obviously she said that 115 was the place for her right now, which is kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? Because there isn't a 125-pound division. So I don't know when we're going to see one. I think when I was over in in Rotterdam, both me and John Morgan asked around a bit about this potential for a 125-pound division, and we both got pretty much the same response that they're aware of it, but it's not something that's in their immediate plans right now. So I don't think we're going to see anything in the near future. So really, it's just down for Jojo to campaign at 115. As for losing to a smaller woman, Jessica Andrade is not your average small strawweight. She's incredibly powerful. Of course, she's moved down from bantamweight, so I think that was only her second fight at 115. She absolutely destroyed Jessica Penne in her first fight at 115. Looked very impressive again against Joanne Calderwood on Saturday. And I think she's probably one win away maybe from being considered as a potential threat to Joanna Jacek, and she'd certainly pose a very different threat to anybody else in that division. She'd certainly be the most aggressive challenger available to take on Joanna Champion. So interesting to see who she fights next. Maybe someone like Rose Namajunas might be lined up. I think that would be very interesting, because Rose is obviously right there, and she's going to need a fight. So maybe Andrade is the one. But the fight I would love to see, I don't know if I'd ever make it. I tweeted it afterwards, and it got a few likes and a few comments. I'd love to see Andrade take on Claudia Gadelha. I think that would be a fantastic matchup. And I don't know how long the fight would last, but it would be high-paced, aggressive, and exciting for as long as it does. I think that would be great. But as for Jojo, I think she's just got to get back to the drawing board and come again, and just keep plugging away at 115, because you're only 1 or 2 wins away from being considered a title threat when you're sitting in that top 10. But when 125 comes, then absolutely she should move up to 125, and I think she'd be a serious threat in that division.
Graham Hughes tweets in and says, do you guys think Pimblett will now get the call from the UFC? So outside of the UFC this weekend, there was a lot of it was a pretty big combat sports action-packed weekend. You referenced the Kell Brook fight versus Triple G of the weekend, Si. There was also Chai Lewis Parry had another big win for Glory. He's someone that everyone should keep an eye on, a British heavyweight who's expressed his desire to transition into MMA full-time. And I mentioned, I think, last week or the week before that he's already got a dialogue going with the UFC, and he's currently training with the likes of Daniel Cormier and Cain Velasquez at the American Kickboxing Academy. But close to home, over the weekend, Cage Warriors had their event in Liverpool with Pimblett now becoming their featherweight champion. Simon, what can I say? He's got that it factor about him, hasn't he? And the UFC could certainly use him for maybe the upcoming Belfast card or for future European cards, especially those of them that are going to take place in the UK. He's 12-1. He's a champion, and I think the time is perfect. What do you think, Si?
Totally agree. He's got the lot, hasn't he? I mean, he's on this fantastic win streak at the moment. I think it's 8 fights in a row, and I think most of those have come inside a distance. I think 6 or 7 of those come inside a distance. But he's got the personality on the microphone. He's just got that aura about him that just says star. And from the UK perspective, we need people like that in the UFC. He's only young, but he's progressing at such a rate that it's becoming very, very hard to deny that guy he's shot in the UFC. Get him in there. Give him the opportunity and see how he does. I mean, I think he's gonna bring eyeballs to the sport. I think he's got a whole city behind him, and I'm very excited to see just what the ceiling is for Paddy the Baddy Pimblett. I think he could be the closest thing we have to a Conor McGregor-esque personality in the UFC. And it's interesting. Before his fight, Paddy Power, the bookmakers over here in fact they're an Irish bookmaker, but they do big business here in the UK as well. They struck a charity bet with Paddy Pimblett that, but I think they've given him, I think it's like 7-1 or something like that, a £2,000 bet on Paddy fighting and beating Conor McGregor before 2020. And if he wins, then he's going to stand to win. I think it's 10 grand. So I think it's a 4-1 bet. So it's going to be 10 grand for his chosen charity, which is Fight for Autism, which is great. For that, it's nice PR for the bookmakers, obviously, but it's also nice to bring a bit of attention to a charity like that as well. So I thought that was a nice little sideline going into the fight. He put in a great performance, great knockout, TKO. And get him in there. Let's see Paddy Pimblett in the UFC. I think he deserves his shot.
Here. Tony Quaint, our friend in the media from Woe TV, tweets in and says, "People talking about Pettis versus Aldo. What about Pettis versus Edgar for New York?" I think regardless of what happens with McGregor, whether he fights Eddie Alvarez for the lightweight championship or if he fights Aldo for the unification bout for the featherweight championship, I'm just not in favour of Anthony Pettis getting a title shot after just one fight and one win at 145 pounds. I think Max Holloway is ahead of him and should get Aldo if McGregor fights Alvarez. And the fight personally that I really want to see is Pettis versus Edgar. I think that'll give Pettis a chance to get a second fight at featherweight under his belt, so that he can just get used to the weight class a little bit better. And to be honest with you, if you're going to drop down to featherweight and fight for the title, you've got to fight someone who's got the name value, like Frankie Edgar. You beat Frankie Edgar, by all means, go and fight for the title. But until you do that, I think you're 1 or 2 steps away. I mean, what do you think, Si?
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree with that. By the way, did you see Anthony Pettis on the telly at the weekend? It was him and Tyron Woodley, and they were doing an interview. And Pettis was the bigger man on screen right then. Everyone was going, "Have you seen the size of Anthony Pettis?" He was a big unit this past weekend. So and that doesn't, I'm not saying he's massively out of shape. That's a bit rich coming from me. But he was way bigger than you would expect him to look. Bigger than Tyron Woodley, so that was kind of interesting. But yeah, I think the fight with Edgar makes all sorts of sense. Edgar needs a good big name opponent, having come off that defeat to Jose Aldo. I think Pettis needs a big name opponent to further establish himself in that featherweight division. As you say, if anyone other than Max Holloway gets a shot at Jose Aldo, then it's a travesty, in my opinion. Max Holloway absolutely deserves to be fighting Jose Aldo next. I hope that's the fight that they make. But yeah, I think Anthony Pettis versus Frankie Edgar is an absolute slam dunk. They have to make that fight. It makes complete sense. And that was the fight that Tony suggested, yeah?
That was, yeah. Well,
he's spot on.
Tony basically says, what about Pettis versus Edgar for New York? Like I said, that's the fight that I tweeted the minute Pettis won his featherweight debut. I think that's a fight that makes sense. It gives Edgar an opportunity to fight on the New York card, which I know means a lot to him, and it gives him a big value, big name opponent in Pettis, where a win for Edgar over Pettis again just puts him right back in the mix. So yeah, I agree with that as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we're all in agreement, which is not that interesting for a podcast, but there you go. I think it makes that much sense, doesn't it? It makes that much sense. Him versus Edgar, winner of that is either in contention for a title fight or is going to be in a number one contender fight. So, and it's one of those former champion versus former champion. Both those guys held the UFC lightweight belt at various stages in their career. Never fought before. It's one of those fights where people who've been following the UFC for any length of time, they're going to get excited about that fight. So, get it booked.
Absolutely. Final question coming in from Fraser Smith. Who would you like to see Jimmy Rivera fight next? I mean, we talked about it earlier on, side. This fight and this win over the weekend against Uriah Faber. I mean, looking at the rankings as I am right now, which haven't been updated as of recording of this podcast, Rivera is ranked number 12. Ahead of him, you've got Eddie Wineland, Thomas Almeida, John Dodson, Michael McDonald. I think he'll skip past all of them, to be fair. That win over Faber, I think, will break him into, I'd say, the top 6, top 7. and then you've got some really meaty fighters. And I think at the moment, number 7 ranked Aljamain Sterling, that would be a cracking fight. But the thing is, with Rivera, and I can't remember the exact specifics of the injury, but he's got a situation, and I don't know if it was an orbital injury or a retina injury. Maybe Simon, if you can remember, I know he's dealing with an eye-related injury coming out of his fight with Uriah Faber, so he might be out for some time. But in regards to matchmaking, I wouldn't mind seeing him versus Aljamain Sterling. What do you think, Si?
Sterling would be a great fight, and again, I know we keep banging on about this New York card, but Aljamain Sterling versus Jimmy Rivera, two guys who come from that part of America. You know, they're nearby. Both of those guys would have huge support. That would be a good matchup to make. If you're Jimmy Rivera's management, however, the fight that I would be looking for, I'd be looking for him to fight the highest possible ranked opponent that you can, while also being realistic. And I'm looking at these rankings, and Rafael Assunção might not be a terrible matchup for him. I think he's ranked 3rd. He's been in there with some good guys. Obviously, he's coming off a loss to TJ Dillashaw at UFC 200, but he went the distance with Dillashaw, and he remains one of the toughest campaigners in that 135-pound division. I think with the likes of Sterling and Caraway, that's a fight that people have talked about for a while. There's also the potential of Thomas Almeida, who has dropped way down the rankings, giving you an idea of the quality of this division. He's had one loss, and all of a sudden he's almost fallen off the rankings. He's 10th. So, you know, I think he's certainly got a say in that division, and I think he'll come again for sure. And he will fight for a world title in the next year or two. I'm pretty sure of that. But yeah, I think Jimmy Rivera versus Rafael Assunção, from a business point of view, if you're Jimmy Rivera's management, that would be the one I would push for. But a local derby versus Aljamain Sterling would be interesting. I don't know what the relationship is between those two guys. They both seem pretty amiable, affable guys. I don't know whether there's any kind of gym rivalry or anything like that. So, but yeah, that would be an interesting one if they can get it on the New York card. But it looks like, as you say, Jimmy's got an eye injury. I don't know exactly what the eye injury is, other than he took a nasty poke in the eye. So you just hope that it isn't anything lasting, and that whatever time it takes for him to get it sorted and to just rest it. I don't know whether he's got a torn cornea or whether there's something more serious involved there. But yeah, I think, you know, we need to, when it comes to, you know, your eyesight, you can't be too careful. So hopefully Jimmy will get the all clear. Everything will be okay for him soon. I think the fight I'd push for is Assunção. That would be the one I'd go for.
Good shout. That's a wrap, Si. That's all the questions we had this week. And again, really want to give a shout out and thank you to everyone who submitted the questions. Like I said, if I didn't get to read out your question, it's probably because we've already addressed it in the show at some point, or was already asked by somebody else. But appreciate you tweeting in nonetheless. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. You can send us your questions to either one of us on Twitter, at Sandhu MMA, at Simon Head, or you can send it, of course, to our show account, which is at the Brit Pack MMA. Any suggestions for the show, any feedback for the show, please do feel free to ping us your feedback via a tweet. We're on iTunes. Please subscribe to us on iTunes if you are an iTunes user. We're available on Acast, we're available on SoundCloud, and we are also available on Stitcher. Main place to go to stream the show from your computer, from your phone. Probably the easiest place to go is SoundCloud. SoundCloud.com/TheBritPack. You'll get all our back issues are on there as well. So if you want to hear just how bad we were on show 1, please do feel free to go back and have a listen. And hopefully you'll see a little bit of progress from then to now, 8 shows in. Thank you to everyone for listening. We've got UFC Fight Night in Hidalgo, Texas this weekend. Don't forget, tweet us, let us know how you watch how you cope with these late UFC nights, and let us know whether you've got any special plans for the upcoming UFC 204 event in Manchester, which of course is going to be held in the middle of the night. That pretty much wraps things up for us on this week's show. Enjoy the fights next weekend. and we will speak to you next Monday.